the bottles, and the new gas they created was trapped as bubbles. In the 1600s, the winemakers of Champagne began experiments that would turn accidental bubbles into a legendary sparkling wine. The most famous of these pioneers was a monk named Dom Perignon. The phenomenon of slightly sparkling wine is as old as the Bible, which describes wine that moveth itself. But bubbles had always come accidentally. So who was the first person to deliberately make sparkling champagne? No one knows for sure, but the person who gets the most credit lived and worked here, at this monastery in the heart of the Champagne vineyards. For centuries, French monks had made wine for religious services and to sell to help pay their monastery's expenses. Here at the Abbey of Auvillers in the late 1600s, a monk called Dom Pierre Perignon was the most famous of several monks working on the mystery of sparkling wine. Dom Perignon was already famous for his still wines, which brought enormous prices throughout France. Experimenting with bubbles then became his life's work.
Dom Perignon really worked as a scientist. This is really his genius. He actually worked step by step. He never gave up.
His main problem was existing technology. In the late 1600s, cork was not used to seal wine. Bottles were plugged with a piece of wood wrapped in hemp, hopeless for keeping the air out or bubbles in.
This type of cork would pop out all the time, and that can't keep the pressure in the bottle.
Dom Perignon probably heard about cork from visiting monks from Spain, where the best cork trees grow. Much more elastic than wood, cork sealed the bubbles in, but this created a new problem. The pressure inside exploded the bottles until Dom Perignon began using stronger English glass that was fired with coal instead of wood. Now the monk had all he needed to trap the sparkle in the bottle and keep it there. But there was one further problem.
The mice in the cellars here in Auvillers were very keen on this string and the cork. And he actually had to cover the top of the bottle and the cork with wax to prevent the mice from eating the cork.
The new sparkling champagne was slammed by the critics in the early 1700s. Some called it an abomination and the devil's wine. And one writer suggested that the sparkle came from adding pig manure. Nevertheless, the new bubbly soon became all the rage in French society. Hedonists at the French royal court found it indispensable. One duke wrote that no orgy began until, quote, everyone is in the state of joy that champagne brings. King Louis XV's mistress, Madame Pompadour, said champagne is the only wine that leaves a woman more beautiful after drinking it. And the popular champagne saucer glass is believed to have been inspired by a glass modeled on Queen Marie Antoinette's breast. The first house to specialize in sparkling champagne, Roederer, began trading in 1729, and others soon followed. Noblemen continued drinking champagne right through the French Revolution. In fact, for some of them, it was the last thing they did before seeing the guillotine.
Many aristocrats, before being executed on the scaffold, used to drink champagne as a supreme comfort. And they had the possibility to buy some champagne and to drink it in the jail.
The post-revolutionary period saw the rise of one of the most powerful friends Champagne has ever had, Napoleon Bonaparte. The brilliant French general who set an army marches on its stomach stopped in Champagne on his way to every battle to stock up with bottles to take to the front. In Champagne, Napoleon always stayed at the home of his old friend from military school, winemaker Jean-Remy Moet. But once Napoleon was crowned emperor in 1804, Moet built Napoleon twin mansions and gardens in the town of Epernay.
his friend, Mr. Moet, considered that really his house was becoming a little bit too small to receive an emperor with his court, and it is why he decided to enlarge a bit his home to have room enough to receive the emperor with his court. It is after that Mr. Moet was in position later to welcome his friend when he was crossing the region.
The mansion became the emperor's regular watering hole on his way to battle. Only once did he neglect to stop here, on his way to the Battle of Waterloo, his final defeat. 1 century later, a mistake of similar catastrophic proportions was made when the owners of the Titanic failed to launch her with champagne.
The conclusion is that before each great battle, not only military battle or business battle or love battle, don't forget to take a glass of champagne before. It can be of some use.
While Napoleon had been conquering and losing Europe, Champagne's winemakers were fighting their own battles to refine their product into the drink we know today. One of the biggest problems was that the wine was often cloudy because of sediment formed by dead yeast cells inside the bottles. But how could winemakers remove the sediment without losing the bubbles? The solution came from an unlikely source, a young widow who'd become a champagne maker by chance. When Nicole Barbe Ponsardin was widowed at 27, she decided to run her husband's company herself under her married name. As widow, or Veuve Clicquot.
It was not easy at the beginning. She was young, very young. She was in a world of business usually where ladies were not part of the trip. And she succeeded.
Madame Clicquot was obsessed with curing the sediment problem, which marred the sight and taste of champagne. To find a solution, she made secret trips down to the cellars at night to make her own experiments. She installed her kitchen table there and had holes drilled in it so that she could place the bottles upside down. By using gravity and turning the bottles by hand, she found that the sediment would all collect on the cork.
She, little by little, made the experiments by turning a certain way for a certain time until she reached almost something perfect.
With the help of her cellar master, she finally arrived at the idea of tilted tables, where the bottles could be turned over a period of several weeks. Once all the sediment had fallen into the neck, the cork was popped and the sediment in the neck gushed out. Then, before too much of the gas pressure could escape, each bottle was topped up with some old wine and a little sugar and recorked. Soon it was ready to be shipped to the wealthy tables of Europe and America as a bright, clear wine. Madame Clicquot's method of oscillating the bottles by hand is still being used by many champagne firms today. Nearly 200 years later, trained cellar workers can turn 50,000 bottles in a day. The next problem for champagne makers to solve was the bottles themselves. They kept exploding. Winemakers had found that putting some extra sugar in the bottle created a stronger sparkle, but they didn't know why. It wasn't until Louis Pasteur's discoveries in 1859 that the mysteries of yeast and fermentation were explained. So adding sugar was largely guesswork. Too much sugar, and the bottles became time bombs.
Sometimes 10 grams per liter, sometimes 20, sometimes 50, and when it was 50 grams per liter, you could be sure that the bottle will exploded at any time.
Explosions often wiped out half the year's production in some cellars, and workers wore face protection. After Pasteur's discovery, the pressure inside the bottle was standardized at about 90 pounds per square inch, the same pressure as tires on a modern bus. With that advance, an ever